Dateline, Salt Lake Herald Republican, January 7th, 1875. Quote, "If anyone wants to see just how a materialized spirit appears, he can be gratified at the theater tonight, and what makes it doubly interesting is the ghost is a beautiful young lady worth a legion of departed hobgoblins. But the materialized feat is performed and in a style which will put to shame the most expert of spirit mediums. Believers in the materialization business had better attend the seance of Galatea tonight." End quote. I'm Wendy. This is Demolish Salt Lake and the story of seances, ghosts, and the Arnold Dixon Building. Hello and welcome to episode 24. It's October, and in keeping with the time of the year, I have a story about spiritualism, ghosts, seances, and mediums. But this isn't so much a ghost story as it is a story about preying on the grief and emotions of people just to make money. So, just as scary as a ghost story. Let's start with the beginnings of modern spiritualism. Almost all historians agree that the movement started in the small town of Hydesville, New York in 1848. Two sisters, Maggie and Kate Fox, claimed to be able to communicate with a spirit in their house through rappings and knockings. Word spread about the sisters' abilities, and before long, they were communicating with spirits in front of packed audiences around the nation. Soon, more and more people claimed to have the ability to talk with spirits, and more people began to pay for the opportunity to talk with a deceased loved one. With that, the new religion of spiritualism was born. People were attracted to spiritualism for a few reasons. It answered the bigger question of what happens to us when we die and gave people concrete proof of an afterlife, whereas traditional religion asked people to believe on faith. It also allowed people to stand out as individuals. In fact, it was the only religion at the time that saw women as equal to men and allowed women to speak out in public, which was not always something women had the right to do back then. And women used this platform to promote suffrage, equal rights, and abolition of slavery by claiming the messages were coming from the spiritual realm and not from their own ideas. During and after the Civil War, people turned to spiritualists, hoping for the opportunity to talk with their loved ones during a seance. By the end of the war, it was reported that 11 million people believed in spiritualism, and some 35,000 were practicing mediums. There were also those known as spiritualist doctors. These people believed the body was controlled by a magnetic fluid, and when the fluid was imbalanced, illnesses happened. All a spiritualist doctor had to do was wave their hands over the patient, and using their own magnetism, they could restore one to good health. Then there were the spirit photographers, those that claimed they could capture the spirit of a deceased loved one in a photograph. The most famous spirit photograph is of Mary Todd Lincoln. In 1872, she visited William Mumler's studio in Boston to have her photo taken. In the photo, behind a seated Mary, the ghostly image of Abraham Lincoln stands with his hands on her shoulders. This was yet another way for people to connect with their family members on the other side. A few famous people were heavy proponents of spiritualism. One was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, if you're not familiar with him, he was the author of the stories of Sherlock Holmes. Doyle traveled the world promoting the comfort a seance could give to grieving family members. A seance could assure the family that their loved one's passing was easy and painless. At the time, this reassurance came as a great comfort to those who lost family members in World War I. Doyle even visited Salt Lake in 1923, taking to the stage at the Tabernacle on Temple Square to promote the truths of spiritualism. Not everyone was a believer. The famous magician Harry Houdini worked extensively to disprove spiritualism and expose what he called, quote, the perpetrator of this most monstrous fiction, end quote. He stated that, quote, After 25 years of ardent research and endeavor, I declare that nothing has been revealed to convince me that intercommunication has been established between the spirits of the departed and those still in the flesh." End quote. Now, it's worth noting that Houdini made a promise to his wife Bess that after his death, if communication was possible, he would come back to her with a code phrase to prove it. Houdini died in 1926, and for 10 years on the anniversary of his death, she held a seance to contact him. She was never successful. As for the Fox sisters, who ushered in the age of spiritualism, they finally confessed in 1888 that they had faked all the noise by cracking their knuckles and the joints of their feet to make the knocking and rapping sounds. But they were not the only fakes. Spiritualism opened the door to so many looking to con people out of their money. There was even a catalog called Gambles with the Ghosts that sold fake ghost figures, ectoplasm, self-playing guitars, and self-writing slates. Now, this was an easy con. Here were people grief-stricken just looking for a way to communicate one more time with their loved ones. It's easy to prey on people that are vulnerable. Spiritualism came to Salt Lake in the 1870s. Articles about seances and advertisements for mediums started showing up in the newspapers about that time. For a small sum, people would crowd into buildings from houses to theaters to witness the supernatural. Each seance would differ depending on the person conducting it, but it was centered on invoking a spirit or spirits and communicating with them. Knocks and noises like the ones the Fox sisters used were most common. Items moving or instruments playing by themselves were another common occurrence. Some even claimed to produce ectoplasm, which was supposed to be evidence of a spirit materializing, by pulling material out of their mouths. Spoilers, it wasn't ectoplasm, but cheesecloth they had stuffed in their mouths when no one was looking. Still others produced actual spirits in the room, but no one was allowed to move towards or touch the spirits. I bet you can't guess why. Honestly, I could go on and on explaining all the ways spiritualists conducted seances. Now, were they all frauds and con artists? I don't know. Perhaps there were some that could actually conjure spirits and communicate with them, but it's the ones that got caught that are at the center of this story. In 1902, George J. Arnold and James J. Dixon arrived in Salt Lake. They called themselves the Arnold-Dixon Brothers, even though they weren't brothers, and immediately set up shop performing seances. An advertisement in the Salt Lake Telegram in February of 1903 states, quote, "Spirit materializing seances every Thursday and Sunday night, all welcome. Phenomenal test seances every Tuesday night. Admission 10 cents. Arnold-Dixon Brothers, 50 East, 300 South," end quote. At the time, this was the Touraine Hotel located where the vacant Yardstick building is on 300 South in downtown Salt Lake. Now, Arnold and Dixon were best known for making spirits materialize and giving psychic readings. Business was good. The next year, they built a 2-story building at 269 East, 300 South. The first floor seated over 200 people for their shows, and the second floor contained their offices and living space. A notice in the Salt Lake Telegram from December 1905 stated in part, quote, "Nearly 300 people attended last Sunday night's meeting at Arnold-Dixon Hall. Fully 200 who came late were unable to get seats. One lady asked if she would leave the city this winter. The medium answered the question and told her her name, also said that her brother must be very careful, and told his full name and her father's full name and occupation. She had never attended a meeting before. One gentleman asked, 'Will I make money out of my mining interests?' The medium replied, 'Your sister's spirit is here and sends greetings to you, but you did not ask that question because you doubt the outcome of these mines, but just to see what I would predict,' said the medium. He replied that it was exactly what it was. He was a stranger. You don't have to believe in spiritualism to attend these seances. come just to see what they are like. Fully 1,000 people attended them every month, and at least 500 are turned away for want to room. Come by 8 o'clock, and there will be plenty of seats. Admission is 10 cents. Arnold Dixon Hall, 269 East, 300 South Street. Consultations daily, same address, end quote. Now, I should point out that this article was most likely written by either Arnold or Dixon. Back then, advertisements were often in the form of articles, and because of that, highly exaggerated. So, not only were they holding seances to a packed house, but they were also doing smaller sessions. They charged anywhere between 10 cents and $2 for a seance, and people were handing over their money at every opportunity. The men were rich, and their building and its furnishings and their appearance showed it. But the good times in Salt Lake would not last, and soon they would lose just about everything. And for Arnold, this included his freedom. On September 8, 1906, Mrs. Mary Brandon and her son-in-law, W.H. Dye, visited Arnold and Dixon for the purpose of writing an expose on the men. They believed the men to be frauds and wanted to prove it. Dixon was giving them a reading in a darkened room. Through the course of the reading, several spirits materialized. Mrs. Brandon was about to talk to her deceased child when she heard a man's voice and became suspect. She reached out and took hold of the dress the supposed materialized spirit was wearing. She maintained her hold while the spirit struggled to get away. In the midst of the struggle, Mrs. Brandon yelled, quote, "I've caught you, unquote. And then she was punched right in the face and knocked to the ground. It was then that she recognized Arnold was the man under the robe. Now, at the same time, her son-in-law had grabbed onto the robes of another spirit in the room, and another struggle ensued between Dye and the supposed spirit. When the struggle ended, the lights were turned on and Arnold stood in the doorway while Dixon remained sat in the same position as before the chaos began. As Mrs. Brandon and Dye left, she yelled to Arnold and Dixon, quote, "You will pay dearly for this," end quote. Arnold was charged with battery. There was no dispute that Mrs. Brandon had been struck. The 75-year-old woman clearly showed evidence of injury on her face. The question was, who did the striking? His trial took place on September 15th. During the trial, Arnold and Dixon denied everything. They stated that the only way they could account for Mrs. Brandon's injury is that she must have fallen on the chairs or other furniture and cut and bruised herself. Arnold testified that he was on the second floor at the time of the ruckus and had to travel 50 feet down a flight of stairs to see what was going on. This explained why he was standing in the doorway when the lights came on. They also claimed that Mrs. Brandon's injuries came from her son-in-law, as they spotted the two in a scuffle when the lights were turned on. After both sides had presented their evidence, Presiding Judge Whitaker took less than a minute to declare Arnold guilty as charged. He was sentenced to 90 days of hard labor at the city jail. The packed courtroom broke out in cheers of approval as Arnold was escorted out of the room. He was to return back in a few days for his sentencing. In the meantime, he was let out of jail on a $300 bond. It seems Arnold had no intention of going to jail. Just days after his hearing, he and Dixon sold their property and all the furnishings to a Dr. Downing and his son for $9,500 and asked the doctor to keep the matter quiet and just between them. After paying what they owed on the property, the men had about $3,500, which they used to skip town. They were going to avoid the wrath of their victims and a jail sentence at all cost. First, they headed to Provo. They didn't take any luggage with them, and people that spotted the duo said they looked like tramps, which was a huge departure from their usual dapper appearance. They paid cash for their train fare to Los Angeles and asked a friend to send their trunks and other belongings to Los Angeles for them. They boarded a midnight train and left Utah behind. The case against Arnold was finally settled in February of 1907 when Arnold's attorney paid his fines in his absence. Just after Arnold's trial and disappearance, the Salt Lake Herald published a full front-page scathing article about Arnold and Dixon. The paper declared them frauds and explained in detail how they operated, citing examples such as using music to cover up noises of costume changes, using shimmering robes and other luminous material as costumes for spirits, and the use of informants to get information on those who would be attending their seances. They called out their callous behavior of preying on people's grief and emotions to make money. The article also stated that Arnold was, quote, the brain, end quote, and Dixon was, quote, a freak, end quote. Not everyone agreed with this article. A group of men and women wrote a counter-editorial in the Salt Lake Telegram defending Arnold and Dixon and correcting some points made by the Herald. They claimed to have attended over 50 meetings at the Arnold-Dixon building and stated the Herald failed to properly debunk the abilities of Arnold and Dixon. Clearly, this was a contentious subject, and with other spiritualists continued to practice in Salt Lake, the question of seances being real or not would continue for some time. As for George Arnold and James Dixon, they eventually went their separate ways. Arnold left spiritualism behind at some point in his life. I wasn't able to find much about him after he left Utah. I did find a death certificate that I think is his. It states that he died in Los Angeles in December of 1948 at the age of 46. At the time of his death, he was a hotel manager and a widow. He's buried in the Los Angeles Oddfellows Cemetery. James organized the Spiritualist Church of Revelation Incorporated in San Francisco in 1924. He wrote or co-authored a few books, including Daylight Materialization of Psychic Powers of the Reverend James Dixon. He died in November of 1956 at the age of 76. He is buried in Cypress Lawn Memorial Park in Colma, California. The Arnold-Dixon building at 269 East, 300 South was turned into apartments around 1909. It continued to be occupied until the late 70s when it was demolished. In the 80s, an office building was constructed on the site and still stands there today. Spiritualism began to wane in the 20s. It did not totally disappear, but would not see the height of popularity it reached in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Psychics and mediums still abound. But if there's one thing the spiritualist movement taught us, it's that anyone can claim to talk to the dead. Make sure to follow my Instagram and Facebook pages at Demolished Salt Lake Podcast to see pictures of Arnold and Dixon, their house, and some really cool examples of ghost photography. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at Demolished SL Pod. You can also join my Patreon to get early episode releases and really cool additional content. Now, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. I'll be back soon with another story of one of Salt Lake's long-lost buildings, and I'll see you then.